What are the integers? How do we classify them? And what exactly are the natural numbers, the counting numbers, and the whole numbers? Let's find out. Integers are numbers that do not contain a fractional part. Integers include the positive numbers, the negative numbers, and also the number 0. Sometimes the best way to describe a concept is to say what it is not. So let's look at a few numbers that are not integers. The first one is 2.5. 2.5 falls halfway between 2 and 3. 2 is an integer, 3 is an integer. Anything that goes between 2 and 3 is not an integer. 99.9 is very close to 100, but it is not 100 and it is not 99, so therefore it is not an integer. But be careful, if you see a 99.0, in that case, if all the numbers after the decimal point are 0, that is an integer. The number pi is approximately 3.14, a number that falls between 3 and 4, so it is not an integer. Also, decimal numbers and fractions that are negative are not integers. As I said before, the integers are divided into the positive integers that go from 1 to infinity, 0, which is a subset that is completely lonely by itself because it is neither positive nor negative, and the negative integers that go from negative infinity all the way up to negative 1. Many names are used to describe the different subsets of integers. The first one we will look at is the counting numbers, which are the numbers that over the course of history, civilizations started using to count objects, start counting whatever they needed to count. But in mathematical terms, counting numbers doesn't really say that much. It can be confusing. Maybe somebody comes from a different culture where they use some other numbers to count. Maybe some culture counts just in even numbers. So for those people, the counting numbers would be 2, 4, 6, 8. Highly unlikely, but still, saying counting numbers doesn't say that much. However, if you just call them the positive integers, positive numbers are clearly defined and integers are also clearly defined. So I think that just to minimize confusion, the best way to call them are simply positive integers. Now these two terms here also cause a lot of confusion. The first one is the natural numbers. The reason that the natural numbers cause a lot of confusion is because there is no consensus of what the natural numbers are. Depending on what textbook you're reading, some cases the natural numbers include 0 and the positive integers, and in some other cases the natural numbers are just the positive number and exclude the 0. So how can you have a definition that changes depending on what textbook you're reading? It should be more consistent, in my opinion. And whole numbers, at least in English, is clearly defined as the numbers from 0 going to infinity. So the positive integers and also including 0. But if you're like me that first learned about numbers in Spanish, where in Spanish whole numbers are all of the integers from negative infinity to positive infinity. So when you change from one language to another, the definition of what the integers are, the definition of what the whole numbers are, changes, and that can be very confusing for people trying to study mathematics and trying to learn a new language. So in order to minimize confusion, this is the classification of the integers that I prefer to use. I just classify them by their proper name. If you want a set of numbers that goes from 1 to infinity, I just call that the positive integers. If you want to include the 0, you want a set of numbers that goes from 0 to positive infinity, I call that set the non-negative integers. It includes all the integers that are not negative. Obviously, the positive integers are not negative, and 0 is not positive, but it's also not negative. So the set non-negative integers goes from 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to infinity. And the negative integers are simply called the negative integers. So to recap, integers are numbers that do not contain a fractional part. If you have two integer numbers, anything in between them is obviously not an integer. Be careful with the decimal places, because decimal numbers which all the numbers are 0 after the decimal point are integers. The example we used was 99.0. Pi is not an integer, and so are the negative numbers that contain a fractional part. And the least confusing classification, according to just me and no one else, well, maybe some people agree with me, I don't know, but the least confusing classification of integers, at least for me, are just calling them positive integers when they go from 1 to infinity, non-negative integers when they go from 0 to infinity, and negative integers when they are negative. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you found this useful, please subscribe, tell a friend, and don't forget to check some of my other videos and the playlist. Once again, thank you, and see you on the next video.